Holy Gospel of our Lord Jesus Christ according to Mark.
Glory to you, Lord Christ.
Jesus began to teach his disciples that the Son of Man must undergo great suffering and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the scribes, and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. He said this quite openly, and Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. But turning and looking at his disciples, he rebuked Peter and said, "Get behind me, Satan. For you're setting your mind not on divine things, but on human things." He called the crowd with his disciples and said to them, "If any want to become my followers, let them deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For those who want to save their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake and for the sake of the gospel will save it. For what will it profit them to gain the whole world and forfeit their life? Indeed, what can they give in return for their life? Those who are ashamed of me and my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, of them will the Son of Man also be ashamed when he comes in the glory of the Father with the holy angels." The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Christ.
So we're halfway through the Gospel of Mark today, and Jesus, up to this point, had been out in Galilee preaching, teaching, and healing. But at this point, we take an abrupt turn, and he turns toward Jerusalem. He tells the disciples quite openly that he'll undergo great suffering, be rejected, killed, and rise after 3 days. Now, what do you think the disciples heard in that message? Peter heard the suffering, rejection, and be killed. Mark says that Peter took him aside and rebuked him. Took him and rebuked him, words of superiority and authority. Mark used these words for Jesus when he rebuked the demons or the storm. The word could be translated ordered or charged. The issue literally is, who is in charge? Peter acts more like a patron here than a disciple. Jesus has to show who is in charge and strongly, "Get behind me, Satan." Now, the Satan reference certainly goes back to the 40 days in the wilderness, where Satan tempted Jesus to be a very different Messiah, one that would reject suffering and death. Is that not what Peter's trying to do now, telling Jesus to take an easier way? Jesus reminds Peter and all his disciples they belong behind Jesus. Literally, depart behind me. When Jesus called his first disciples, he said, "Follow me and I'll make you fish for people." Literally, come behind me. The rebuke of Peter reminds us where the disciples belong. Then we see that Jesus is telling his followers of all generations they're not to guide, protect, or possess Jesus, they're to follow. After rebuking Peter, Jesus calls the crowd and teaches them, "If any want to be my followers, let them deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me." Now think about that. What reference would disciples of that day have to a cross? In their day, it was the form of public execution imposed on criminals and insurrectionists. They all knew the power of the Roman oppressors, and they witnessed crucifixions over and over again. That was their reference to a cross, not a piece of jewelry, not anything in gold or wood in a church. I'm sure the disciples were confused and needed some help to understand what Jesus was talking about when he said, "Take up your cross and follow me." There still may be confusion about what Jesus was calling his followers to do. I know the cross is not some personal problem or some difficulty in life. Rather, the cross is something you bear because you follow Jesus. The cross is thrust on your back because you're walking behind Jesus. I often think there's this hard concept for us to understand, not just the disciples. I think back to my Moravian past, and the story of two men always comes to my mind. The Moravian community was in a small community in Germany that had come out as refugees out of the Czech Republic onto the estate of Count Nicholas Ludwig von Zinzendorf. That's a name, isn't it? Just call him Nick. Well, he was a very close friend of the Danish king, and he spent a lot of time in Denmark. And there he met a slave from the West Indies. And the slave told him of the miserable conditions that slaves lived in there. Zinzendorf went back to the German community and told them this story. And two men said immediately, we want to go as missionaries and preach the gospel to the slaves. Well, in 1732, Leonard Dober and David Nitschmann left Herrnhut for St. Thomas. They arrived on St. Thomas December 13, 1732. They had a letter from the Danish court that got them a place to stay with a landowner. Nitschmann was a carpenter, so he went to work immediately to support the two of them. Leonard Dober was a potter and found no good clay on the island to do pottery. And then Dober decided he couldn't live with the white wealthy landowners and talk to and relate to the slaves. The first fruits of Leonard Dober's work was an orphan boy. The Moravian church brought his freedom, and that was the beginning. It's hard for me to imagine two German men landing in St. Thomas, 1732, to present the gospel to slaves. The language barriers, the distrust of the landowners, the suspicion of the slaves. But if you go to St. Thomas today, you'll see a large stone church, Memorial Moravian Church, downtown St. Thomas, a witness to the labors of David Nitschmann and Leonard Dober. Now, following Jesus doesn't have to be that dramatic, we hope. I want to talk about Tom Garrett, our friend. Tom had a strong Christian background, even a theological education, but he was in the right place at the right time so many times in our church. In 2012, Deborah Rice had announced her retirement, that she was going to retire. She asked Tom to be senior warden. That was a decision wisely crafted to have the right person in place during transition. Tom was the right person, and he offered steady and reassuring leadership. He worked with the vestry and the diocese to get Jim Clark as the interim, which was a wonderful decision. It offered great continuity and a sense of calm. Little did Tom know that in January of 2012, I met with Bishop Porter Taylor and laid the groundwork for a Moravian, of all things, to come into the Episcopal Church. Tom was my rock. From that first meeting with the vestry, when he had everyone come with a question to ask me, I felt like I was in a Senate confirmation hearing or something. Tom knew how to work with people. He knew his faith. He knew the Episcopal Church. Much later, when I planned a sabbatical for 3 months in 2019, I again approached Tom and said, Tom, would you be senior warden that year? He stepped up and agreed. Tom was one who followed Jesus and continually said yes. Will we say yes and follow Jesus?